Hey there, and welcome to yet another episode of the Virtual CISO podcast. With you, as always, your host, John Verry. And with me today, Jack Naglieri. Hey, Jack.
Hi, John. How are you?
I am excellent. It's Friday, and I'm looking forward to the weekend.
Yeah, it's a little bit rainy and gloomy here today, but
Where,
that's San
where
Francisco for
is
you.
where is here? Oh, that's San Francisco. You're. I should have known. I should have known, knowing that you're a darling of the investment area, that you'd be out in that area, right? I mean, that's where a lot of the good stuff happens. So let's start simple. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what is it that you do every day.
So I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Panther Labs, and our mission is to detect any breach anywhere. And I've been working on the company for the past 3.5 years. And prior to starting the company, I worked as a security practitioner for combined 9 years, let's call it, across VeriSign, Yahoo, and Airbnb, and then decided to start a company uh, to take the plunge into becoming the vendor to build security solutions for security teams. Just because my experience was really challenging as a practitioner in those companies, just due to the tools that we had to our disposal, and we figured out some secret sauce that worked for us in the Silicon Valley companies, and we wanted to build a product that could give value to other security teams, like my former self, 5, 6 years ago. So that was really the whole
Yeah,
idea.
so it's almost like the time travel. You wish you could go back in time and give yourself these tools then. All right. So before we dig into
Yeah.
exactly what the value prop is, always ask, what's your drink of choice?
Alcoholic or in general?
You tell me.
So I don't really drink alcohol. I drink wine very occasionally. I kind of stopped drinking a while ago. I'll do it very,
Mhm.
very occasionally. My drink of choice is a cappuccino for sure. Like a
Yeah.
cappuccino with some type of alternative milk is like my favorite, and I'm a huge coffee person. And San Francisco is the perfect place for that. So that's my drink of choice if I had to
All
pick.
right. So you're in San Francisco. So are you drinking San Francisco? Pete's from is Pete's San Francisco?
Oh, pizza's a chain though. You got to get, there's like Blue
So you're going to the
Bottle,
local.
there's Andy Town. Like, oh my God, there's so many good coffee places here. Like, I think Blue Bottle's the canonical like Bay Area example of like a good coffee shop. You have like Sight Glass, you have Ritual. There's so many, man. It's great.
Yeah,
I'm
we
in
don't
heaven
get that. We
here.
don't get. Yeah, we don't get that many out here. There's like if you go to the smaller chains, like but that are special. Like there's a place called Rook. I don't know if you've ever been to a Rook, but if you're ever traveling on the East Coast and you see a Rook, yeah, it definitely
Hmm.
trumps Starbucks in my book.
Where are you based?
I'm in New Jersey, but the whole East Coast,
Okay.
like you'll see Rooks. They're great places, and my daughter is a lot like you in terms of her taste there. Um, so I think you're in the right place at the right time. Obviously, we've got growing regulatory and stakeholder pressure for what I refer to typically as provable security and compliance, and the importance of having some type of SIM solution, both from a security and compliance validation perspective, is super important. You're taking a very different, in fact, approach to. I'm going to usually use the term SIM. I know that you have maybe a
Oh,
dislike for the
yeah.
term SIM. I know. We'll
I,
talk about
I,
that in a
I
second. But
really hate
so, all
it.
right. So let's just say you're taking a very different cloud native approach. So you started to allude to this. Tell us a little bit about what led you to develop Panther. What was it what challenges were you having, and then and how are you solving those challenges? Because we're still having them. I can tell you that.
Absolutely. So the biggest challenge that I faced as a practitioner was operational overhead and scale. It just wasn't viable to get the data that I need to get into a single place, and it required either we severely limit the data that we're collecting, we filter, we say, oh, we're only going to retain the last 2 to 4 weeks or whatever it may be, whatever we could afford from an ops or licensing perspective. Um, and really, that just put us in a really horrible place. We don't want to be in a position where a breach occurs, we only have 30 days of data because of those limitations, and we can't answer key questions about what an attacker did in our environment. So scale was really always a big limiting factor. And I worked at Yahoo, I worked at companies that had these big data teams, but they weren't at the service of the security team at all. It was very focused on the core business. It was never focused on how do we get our endpoint data into this like Hadoop cluster? But even if you did, no one in security knows how to write a job on the Hadoop cluster. It's not our core competency. Our core competency is how do we identify attacker TTPs? How do we pivot around? How do we do an investigation? How do we ask the right questions to get the right answers around an incident? And that's really what we care about. So there's always this challenge of the tools kind of being there, but it required this big data infrastructure. So fast forward a couple of years later to when I joined Airbnb, and Airbnb was then that next generation of company that was built in the cloud. So when we approached security, we took that same approach. And instead of us having to rack servers and do virtual machines at a much lower level, we were just spinning an EC2 instance up with a button click. And we were using services like AWS Lambda and SQS. And it allowed us to take these like very complicated data systems and go serverless with them. I did a talk in New York in 2016 or 17 that was about going serverless and how it benefited us as security practitioners. And that actually was in relation to an open source project that we released at Airbnb called StreamAlert. So StreamAlert was this idea of how do we take cloud-based services like Kinesis, Lambda, et cetera, kind of connect them all together and build effectively a serverless SIEM that allowed us to process any volume of data, get that response really fast because it's stream processing, and operate at a very high scale with basically no overhead of ops, and allowed us to be even more flexible about how we do our analysis with things like Python. And then eventually the concept of a data lake also was introduced. Like, okay, now how do we store this data? Well, we have to structure it. We have to put it into database tables. And then we're effectively working backwards from that vision I was talking about of like, hey, we have this really sophisticated business data warehouse, but now we're applying it for security. And we get all these benefits of scale, speed, flexibility, and all those core elements built in. Like subsequently, when I started the company, like this is the evolution of those ideas. So
Gotcha.
those were always the key things that caused us to build. And that's what ended up being the reason that we built things like StreamAlert at Airbnb. And it's the same reason why I continued that effort with Panther. So
Gotcha.
that's a little bit of history.
Yeah, and that makes total sense. So, we've been doing SIM for a long time, and there was two places where we saw the bottlenecks, right? And I'm assuming that you saw the same thing, and your migration to the cloud solved both of those. One was on the compute side, if you wanted to do any type of real-time correlation, especially when you got into a situation where you needed to do correlation and the event rates were going through the roof, right? You would just, the system would just log down, you weren't able to do it, or you weren't able to correlate over a long enough period. And then the second thing, of course, was, again, in those same high EPS instances, in the old conventional days, getting them into a conventional database structure, whether it was Oracle or Microsoft SQL, was
Impossible.
Impossible, right? And you'd very often, and if you, God forbid, like we had a problem once at a scale at a Fortune like 100 organization that we were working with, where the automation that was supposed to automatically extend partitions in the database failed, and we had basically a bricked database. And I can't even begin to tell you how long it took to try to spin up another instance, get some of that, and then be able to bleed that information back out. And it caused all kinds of significant challenges. So I'm assuming your migration and the technology processes that you took address both of those limitations.
Which limitations specifically are you referring to?
Compute and storage.
Yeah, it does, because we're effectively offloading it to the service. So as a security team, we're just caring about the business logic. We're not caring about the underlying operational components of it. We don't have to patch servers. We don't have to care about load balancing. We don't even think about that. We just think about how efficient is our system at processing the data. And then that's a much better world to be in, because you completely remove all of the unnecessary components that just don't really play into security whatsoever. And that was a big gripe that I had with Splunk, and even like Elastic, right? Like you could run a bad Elastic query and take down your cluster. And like we saw that so much. Same with Splunk. It's like, well, if we want to get more data in, we gotta add 10 more indexers, and we gotta, think about these things. And, it's completely unnecessary and unrelated to security. Security is just about how do we get the data in that we need? How do we answer questions? How do we correlate around our data? and answer security questions, because that's what we care about at the end of the day. We're accountable to the organization in order to both prevent breaches, but in the event that one does happen, limit the exposure of that breach. And you can only do that with good data. So that really ends up being the thesis of the company, which is that security is a data problem. We want teams to be able to bring that data to life. And that's kind of like the tagline that we say on our website. It's like, bring your security data to life. Like, it's just this idea of, it's been sitting dormant and disparate and sort of spread everywhere and all these different formats, and it has to come together. And that really is a data problem. So using things like fully cloud native architecture, which also runs as a SaaS, again, removes that full operational burden and allows teams to just more easily run at scale. And
Gotcha.
that's a huge win for a lot of teams.
So that idea of abstracting the technical operational stuff away from the security stuff and allowing security professionals to be security professionals, is that I know that you just had a B round. Congratulations. Is that what has folks so excited about what you're doing? Because obviously they voted with their investment, so that they believe in what you're doing.
So are you saying, are the investors bought into the technical approach?
No, I'm sorry. What I was asking is, I was asking, is it that abstraction that you're doing, right? This separating the security from the underlying, technology and operationalization. Is that what has, the investors so excited?
I mean, investors get excited about product market fit. I mean, that's just the reality of things, right? If you see any company that's solving a problem and you get that assurance by looking at the users of that platform and how much people are willing to pay for it, that's what investors are excited about. They're not nuanced enough typically to truly understand like the core of the products, especially a very nuanced one like Panther, which is looking at detection and response. And there's such a small percentage of people in the world who even know how to do that job. So investors were really excited just because, I mean, the core three areas, and this is like somewhat of a tangent about like security, but the core three areas of companies that you need to succeed is like team, market, product. Like you have to nail all of them, basically. You have to have a great executive team that also hires a great team of executors who are able to get things done. You need to have a market that's willing to pay for your product, and you need to have a product that satisfies that market, right? So they're looking at all of these elements. They're doing a whole bunch of analysis, but I'd say the core thing about momentum comes down to product market fit and execution. And if you nail both of those, like you'll continue to grow, and then you'll build more trust, and it's sort of a virtuous cycle at that point.
So before, when I said SIM, you kind of bristled a little bit, and I was on your website, and I think you struggle with the website, and I think you have a page on there that says, you compare a traditional SIM versus Panther, and I think you refer to Panther as SIM reinvented. Can you explain that?
Yeah, one-liner is always interesting, and I don't think anyone's really nailed it yet, including us. I think we could describe the platform in a lot of different ways, but the thing I think, in essence, it comes down to is Panther is the heart of a security operations team, and we can call it whatever we want to call it. We can call it a SIM. We can call it, and if people have been gravitating towards XDR, which I'm like, I don't like that either. Because I don't think a SIM is always tied to endpoint, which is like how I perceive XDR.
Agreed.
And I just think about a security operations center really being focused on detection and response, investigation, and the platform in which it supports that has to take data in, it has to normalize data. So there's a level of ETL, which is separate from SIM fully. But at this scale, if you're saying like a cloud native, like SIM based on a data warehouse, you're kind of combining a lot of different things together. You're combining detection and response, you're combining ETL, you're combining data lakes, like all of these different things. So I've been explaining Panther as like a security analytics platform, security operations platform. It's really meant to be this generalized way to create security intelligence out of all of your different data. And that's really how I've been thinking about it. SIM to me, like I have my own negative connotation with SIM because I was a practitioner and I knew they didn't really work.
Exactly.
And they weren't working for me because they weren't practical with how I was actually doing things. So that ended up being the reason that a lot of people are like, yeah, expensive, slow thing that doesn't actually reflect reality. Like that's kind of what SIMs were perceived as. And we're trying to change that. We're trying really hard to change that and make sure that one, we can at least operate at the scale that's needed at a cost that's reasonable. And like to me, that's baseline, right? After that point, then it's like, how do we make the workflows as practical as possible to reflect what we see in reality, which is people want to use things like CI/CD for managing these detections. They want to programmatically interact with this platform, this security operations platform, or this whatever SIM platform, and they just want a way to really be effective at scale for once, because SIMs would just throw out false positives all the time. There weren't really easy ways to tune them. There wasn't an easy way to really express the behavior you were looking for. And in this world where we're operating at scale, you have to start to use these things like data warehouses and software, and you have to just automate things because we're defending against attackers that are using automation against us. So speed is very important, and we have to be able to have speed and visibility about everything that's going on. And very sophisticated systems are required to do that. And that's been the constant challenge in security. So these architectural decisions that we chose allow us to get around that and continue on this journey of being good defenders.
Yeah, so I guess that challenge is that you do a lot of things that a SIM does. You do them way better, and I agree with that. The problem is that using a new name, people are still going to the market looking for quote unquote a SIM. So you almost have to have.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's an educational selling challenge. In that you need to educate them that yes, this kind of looks that way, but it's like you said, reimagined or reinvented, I think is a nice way to say it. Because there is such a negative connotation with SIMs, definitively and deservedly so. I think the vast majority, if you look from, we started implementing SIMs in 2004 with eSecurity, we did network intelligence, we did Cisco Mars. You look at the vast majority of the projects that we did, long-term, they were failures, which is why we literally stopped selling SIM for that reason, because generally speaking, you were not able to keep a client happy. And even if you got the darn thing operational at one point in time, it's just the drift, as the organization changed, as technologies changed, as systems changed, FQDNs changed, the care and feeding and maintenance necessary was way too high. So you mentioned Snowflake before, and you mentioned data lakes, and you also mentioned that 2% of the people really understand what security practitioners do. Less than 2% probably really understand what Snowflake and data lakes are. Can you just briefly explain them? Because I know they're critical to your product and people understanding the value prop.
I mean, in the simplest terms, a data lake is a very, very, very big database, like a big relational database is how I would think about it, right? And there's a lot of different ways to sort of slice and dice it, because data lakes can be structured and unstructured. So let me sort of rephrase this and say, like, data lakes are using things like generalized blob storage like S3 and storing your data. And then data warehouse is making it usable. So Snowflake is trying to be the de facto like cloud data warehouse, to where you can feed as much data as you want into this relational database. And then it will elastically scale because it has a separation of storage and compute. So typically the bottleneck would always be like the Splunk scenario I gave you, which is I have more data, I need more indexers. Whereas in Snowflake, that doesn't become a thing anymore. It's just I put my data in at rest. It's stored in some really low cost storage, and then I load compute instances to get to that data versus it being a bottleneck on the way in. So data lakes allow us to have these like massive, call it like a SQL database, huge scales like petabytes, and more than that. It just kind of becomes infinite at a certain scale. And then your bottleneck becomes like, how much compute do you want? How fast do you want this thing to run? The other thing that really goes into data lakes is efficiency and storage. So there's this idea of columnar storage. So instead of storing the entire record in like a single row, you would store the columns of it, and then it allows for more efficiency in queries. So when you say like select username from my logins, it's just loading that username. It's not loading the entire row. So it becomes much more performant. So that's really the thing that went into this technology, is like, we have a lot of data. We need to search it fast. So what are these things that we can do in compression and storage and compute in order to make that happen? Prior, if we were just using something like a Postgres or MySQL database, we'd be very limited with that tight coupling of storage and compute. And data lakes sort of decoupled it and made it much more scalable. But there's always going to be trade-offs, even with data lake solutions. Like AWS has options. We have things in Google now, like BigQuery, and then you have Snowflake and Databricks, and like there's a lot of players that really came up in this market. So it's just really a way to operate at a quote unquote cloud scale without having to worry about the storage and compute coupled together. That's like the basis of it.
Thank you. That was extremely helpful. So, you guys are, because of the fact that you're near real time or real time effectively, I would assume that you're able to do some things which we traditionally haven't done. I would say that the vast majority of the time when we've used the SIM, and sorry to keep using that term, but I think people relate to it.
It's okay.
Using a security operations platform, we're behind the curve. By the time that we find out about something happening, it's happened, and now we're sort of in response. Are we to a point where using Panther, we can go to like more of a proactive security, where it's not incident detection? It's if you follow the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? We're further along, so that we're actually detecting and responding, perhaps even in an automated way, faster than it can get to the point where I've been that security event has had any impact to me.
So speed was always a core element of why we wanted to rebuild this system, even going back to the Streamalert days. A core complaint with Splunk and other SIMs was that it just took a long time to get any answers. And when you think about traditional security monitoring, let's say you have certain TTPs that you're modeling from MITRE ATT&CK across the kill chain. You would run this as a scheduled search. So going back to the coupling of storage and compute, when you have a lot of data, it just takes a lot longer to process, and it's much less efficient in those systems. So the reason that we built the real-time element in Panther is to completely wipe that away, to where if you have like very simplistic sort of point in time things, it becomes very easy to find that right away. The beauty with Panther also is that because we're effectively doing stream processing, and we're using Python, we can get really, really creative and really clever with how we do analysis. So we can cache certain things in really high speed storage, like DynamoDB, for example, which is like an implementation detail. But just imagine like why caching is really useful in web applications. It's the same thing. You can keep counters. You can keep certain events. Like we have a built-in detection that's like improbable logins, which is a very canonical example that most people are used to, which is Jack logged in from San Francisco, and then 5 minutes later he logged in from Rome. And it's like, well, that's impossible. Like geographically, you can't travel that fast. Versus if an employee in the remote first world, which is very common, goes from SF to Sacramento in that hour, like, yeah, it's fine. That's not suspicious. But if we see like a login in one place, maybe that user got phished, and then now their credentials are getting used somewhere else. So it's like, because we're using Python and because we're streaming these things across, like we get the benefit of like speed and flexibility. So getting over the speed element was really important. And then doing stream level processing just changes your perspective about how detection even works. We have this ability to also query the data lake periodically. So we can say that we want that to become a source in our event stream. So we can say, in the last hour, show me all of the logins that happened, and then let me filter those, right? So there's a lot of ways, because we've created this really sort of powerful streaming engine plus rules engine. It creates a huge amount of flexibility in how we do this detection, which allows us to be more proactive. There are certain limitations in terms of like, the style of doing detection. Like, for example, we're not going to find anomalies for you magically, right? Like the style is very deterministic by design, and who knows what will happen eventually. Like, I think there's certain applications of statistical analysis and machine learning that play a lot into useful security, but largely I would say like 80% of those things are expressible by behaviors, because every single environment is different, and every single like really, really good attackers look like normal humans. So it's very typical to just throw machine learning into the problem and be like, okay, you go solve it. It's like, it's a little bit harder than that. And you have to really understand like what you're protecting. So being able to model that out in code gives a huge amount of flexibility, and Python is a very approachable language too. So most security practitioners have used Python for processing data because they had an incident. And actually, in a lot of ways, that's typically why they had to use Python in the past. They're like, oh, we copied a bunch of log data and now I have to process it. It's like, well, what if you could just do that as it's streaming? And that's basically what Panther is. We give users that ability, and that allows them also to sort of up-level their own skills in software development. And it doesn't have to be very complicated. It's actually quite basic, where we're doing like, field equals value, field in list. There are these very basic patterns that emerge. But for those who are savvy developers, they can really go in and extract the power of third-party libraries, built-in libraries, using security tools that are very popular. Like Netflix has a number of open source Python tools that are great. So it really does change the perspective of like how we can do this analysis. And that's the part that's been the most interesting for me. And it's just a whole new capability that security teams haven't really had yet.
Yeah, listen, I think the idea of using pandas, I love your term approachable. Last year I decided that I hadn't been in code for a long time and picked back up with a programming language, and I played with Python. And I was just amazed at the extensibility of the environment and the number of tools that are out there for,
Right.
For every potential field of use. So, and the other thing which is great about Python is that you go to the internet and you search and you can find the answer to almost any Python question that's ever been posted with some sample code, which is awesome. So I'm assuming that your best use case is probably organizations that are similar to the ones that you came from, right? SaaS, cloud service providers, organizations that have, that are probably working in a CI/CD world. They've got continuous compliance requirements. They've got, online entities that are generating massive amounts of information. Am I missing anything? Are there any other use cases that you see Panther being really significant for?
The most significant ones I see are just threat detection and response. So corroborating all the data together from anywhere. So when I say any breach anywhere, what I'm referring to is taking your cloud data, your endpoint data, your network data, your application data. We see that very common, and pulling it all together into a unified format that's searchable, pivotable, correlative, all of these things. Like that in itself is a very hard problem to solve. And then on top of that, then now you can look for certain types of behaviors. So I'd say the primary use case is true incident response and proactive detection. And then the secondary is compliance. It's helping your ops team out with certain things. It's just understanding those patterns and being able to relay to other internal stakeholders.
Gotcha.
Which is common for security.
Yep. And you said obviously you said threat detection and response. Are you providing any type of a SOC service or any third parties providing a SOC service, or is the intention that the orgs that you'd be working with would be providing that response themselves?
Right. It's the latter.
Any thoughts on that? Is that in the future for Panther, or are you guys going to stay just on the non-response side of the equation?
My intention today is to remain product company versus a services company. So, but you never know what will happen in the future. I mean, CrowdStrike famously added their response service later, but initially they weren't. So when it's a bigger company, who knows? If enough of our customers want it and we have the expertise to deliver on it, maybe we'll change our mind. But I think today, in the state of, in the spirit of focus, it's best to just be really good at one thing, and that's kind of the idea that I like right now. It's a better business model, I think, as well.
I know that probably a large percentage of the data that you're getting is coming from cloud-based sources based on what you're doing, and I think you just mentioned that you do capture on-prem data. So does that you mentioned EDR specifically, so you're taking feeds from EDR. If folks want to feed in stuff from their corporate networks as well, that's possible as well. Any breach anywhere.
Absolutely.
So any breach anywhere means any breach anywhere. Okay.
Right. So the really powerful thing that we've built is if any company has custom internal data, or they have data that we just don't support yet, but it goes to an S3 bucket or a queue or something, you can connect that into Panther and you can infer the schema of that data. And then at the other side of that, what you end up getting is a security data warehouse with that data. So we'll basically ETL the data transformer for you, and we'll give you an ability to infer that schema, pull out the indicators like domains, IPs, hashes, things like that you care about, that you want to pivot on, and you can write Python on it as it streams. So very powerful. and it applies to just generic data that you just have sitting in a bucket. So that ETL can take teams years to get, to be honest. Like it's such a non-trivial thing to build and maintain over time, to your point. Like for things that drift and error, it's just removing the ops overhead for a system like that is such a
So
massive
that's
win.
almost like you're sort of doing like auto, like in the old days, we'd call them agents. Do we have an agent that understands how to parse this particular data source? It's almost as if you're doing auto agent creation, right? You're taking the data. I mean, does that go down to the level of like one of the other challenges that you always have with different types of data sources, data normalization? When you say that you're ETLing it, you're automatically figuring out what type of data we're having. And are you
Right.
able to normalize it as well? So, port, like if we have this scheme that port
Mm-hmm.
80, HTTP, web, they all mean the same thing, right? I want to normalize that. Or I have three different firewalls and, one uses different terminologies for accept and reject and drop, and it'll normalize that stuff automatically as well.
So normalization has a lot of different
Mm-hmm.
definitions. So there's normalization where you're saying normalize into the same
Okay.
format, because a lot of security logs exist as
Yeah.
CSVs or JSONs or HTTP style logs or whatever. So there's a normalization that's happening
Okay.
from there to there, from raw log to structured log, which is more
Mm-hmm.
like
Yep.
parsing, like parse the log into its structure, and then there's a normalization step after. The things that we normalize that we focus on today are really pulling out indicators and normalizing
Mm-hmm.
event times. And then in our rule engine, we actually have this mechanism of doing what you're describing, which is I want to look at all like dest port
Right.
22 traffic that XYZ, like other thing I care about. And I want to search that across all of my logs. Like we have the ability to do that in real time today. And then historically, it's a bit more around pivoting on indicators
Oh,
and
that's
things like
cool.
that.
That's cool. So that port
Yeah.
22, TCP 22, SSH, all ends up being to you the same thing. And when I do my query, I'm going to get a return of all that information.
Right. In the rules today, and then on the data lake, it's something that we're unifying together
Excellent.
now.
And then,
Yeah.
I read you on your site. You did the State of SIM 2021. But we're back to that word you hate. Um, and,
Yeah.
and there was one finding that stood out to me was that approximately 20% of companies said it took 12 months or more to deploy. Thoughts on that, and any other findings that in your State of SIM that you thought were particularly interesting to you?
Um, yeah, that one's interesting. I think there's always going to be a very long tail of deployment, so I'd be really curious on like why teams would answer a certain way. Like what is done to them? Is done like I got my critical data sources in and now we're good and now we have our detections, or is done like it literally took that long to just get it viable, which is my assumption. And I can see why that happens in certain companies, especially when the infrastructures are so complex and you have to get a lot of sign off and approvals to deploy SIMs. So in the world where I was racking servers or where I was like spinning up like all the necessary components, like that could
Hmm.
certainly take months. Like it would not surprise me whatsoever. And when I made these changes at companies like Yahoo and Airbnb, it's getting the blessing from the ops team, because if you think about what you're doing in incident response, it's like I need to deploy tools that's going to collect a lot of data, push it to a single place. I need to make sure there's not going to be a bad performance hit on those servers that support the business. Because if that goes down because of security, then you've caused a lot of problems, right? Then you don't have a business to protect anymore. So it's like that's the trade-off that you make. Um, I can't necessarily recall any other specific finding in the
That's
report.
okay. I that
I
was
could pull it up and we can like
I
talk
just thought it
through
was
it, but
I thought it was
that
a
was
really
the
well
one.
done study. To be honest, and the other thing too that was always the problem is, even if we probably spent in some of our organization we work with, we spent more time fighting with the SAN team for space than we did actually trying to get things set up, right? And who's going to pay for all
Right.
the storage, right? So this idea of taking 12 months. Yeah. So quick
Yeah.
question for you. So, when if I was to, I was a potential client of yours and I said, hey, how long is this going to take to get this stood up? So I would agree with you that a lot of organizations are not getting a lot of value out of the SIMs for, 4 to 12 months. What would be the typical ramp time for Panther?
I mean, you could get into the tool today, onboard data, and then you can get alerts on the built-in detections we've created. So it's pretty much immediate. As soon as you can connect your data sources in, we'll start pulling data. It gets normalized. It gets put in the data lake. It gets run over the built-in detections we have, and then you can start to craft your own. You can write searches. It's pretty immediate. There's no other, like, because it's a serverless architecture, you just need us to stand up your account for you, and that's basically it. So you can get going and get it. Like, I would say savvy security engineer who's been doing monitoring for quite some time gets value right away from it.
Um,
Yeah.
we beat this up pretty good. Anything we missed? Anything else that folks should know?
Well, so when you were mentioning the state of SIM report, like the one thing you meant, we could have talked about as
Okay,
well as
cool. Yeah,
cost,
let's touch on.
because that's been a huge
Yeah,
bottleneck.
let's talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, the canonical reasons that people hate SIMs are they're expensive and they're slow and they're impractical, right? So expensive and slow kind of get fixed at the same time when you have cloud native for a lot of reasons, because you're becoming more efficient with processing. You're sort of outsourcing certain things because it's very expensive to just run servers. That's just a constant thing that's always on, versus moving to the cloud, it becomes consumption based. And that's just more economical and more efficient. So there's a byproduct where, by us designing things in an efficient way, we naturally have a lower overhead, and we pass that down to our customers. So we come in at like a 50 to 70% discount of a typical SIM at that same scale, actually at a much higher scale than was even viable before. So that's a huge benefit for a platform like Panther, and it's a huge reason why we wanted to build something cloud native. So, you get those scale benefits, but also you get the lower cost
And
benefits.
when you say that, when you use that 50 to 70%, is that versus conventional on-prem SIM, or are we going to the more modern cloud-based SIM world of the Splunks or the AT&T cybersecurities or something of that nature?
It's just across the board, in my opinion. I don't think there's a huge difference, even if we compared like Elastic, Sumo, Splunk. Like, you're still paying to get a true production scale. You're going to pay millions and millions of dollars for that to work, and then you probably still won't get what you want out of it. So that's the most frustrating part.
And that would be and like you said, at that dollar level, that's quite the cost savings to be able to do it at that price point. Cool stuff. Well, thank you. This has been fun. Question for you. I always ask, give me a fictional character. Oh, he's smirking at me. I wonder if he remembers that I put this into the agenda. We're gonna see how Jack. We're gonna see how fast you can think on your feet if you don't remember this. I asked this. Okay.
Yeah, let's see.
Give me a fictional character or a real world person you think would make an amazing or horrible CISO, and why.
A fictional
or real.
Fictional or real?
Or real. It could be you. It could be you.
Oh my god. I'm not prepared for this question. I don't know why, but like for some reason, like Trump came to my head, like someone who'd be a horrible CISO.
I'm shocked. I am shocked. This is the 80th episode or 80th. No, that's the first time someone went Trump. That's the first time somebody went Trump. All right, so explain.
I just thought,
or does it not need? Or does it not need explanation?
About a thing that didn't work. I don't think it needs explanation, but I just thought it'd be hilarious. Like, this is gonna be the
it's gonna be huge. Ever. It's gonna be huge.
You know, like,
I'm gonna protect you from China. You know what? Just for the record, we're probably both under. We are. Yeah, the Midwest is not happy with us right at this point. The Midwest and Deep South are very unhappy with you, Jack. You must be one of them liberals from San Francisco.
I don't know what they expected.
All right. That may have been the best answer that I've had. If folks wanted to get in touch with you, what would be the best way to do that? Or you're Panther.
Panther.io.
Excellent.
Yep. Or at Run Panther on Twitter, at Jack Naglieri on Twitter. Yeah, I would put my email, but it's not that hard to figure out.
Thank you, Jack.